All right, we've talked a lot about vineyards and growing wine grapes. So I want to change the focus a little bit. If we're growing wine grapes, why are we doing it? To make wine. And I believe that a good vineyard manager, a good vineyard operation needs to understand their finished product. It's a collaboration between the winemaker and the wine grape grower in order to get that ultimate finished product that the winemaker is seeking to provide the consumer. So the more a wine grape grower, a vineyard manager, knows about the needs of the enologist or winemaker, the better. And so I'm introducing the topic here uh, with a special focus on the factors that would be important to know as a grower of wine grapes. So, a quick overview: grapes are fermented by yeast and converted into wine. So, the sugars in the juice of crushed wine grapes provide the food, and the single-celled fungal organisms called yeast will eat that sugar, and in the process of converting that sugar into energy to grow and divide and make more yeast, the byproduct is alcohol. And we use yeast converting sugar into alcohol to make wine. And there are many processes where yeast are used. In bread making is one example that people are familiar with raised or leavened bread. We add yeast, and the yeast causes the bread to rise. So again, the yeast are eating something in the bread. They're eating the carbohydrate in the flour and producing some gas in that case. And so yeast are very valuable in a number of different industries, but in this case, they are making wine. The conversion of sugar to alcohol is the process of fermentation. And when we're making other kinds of alcohols like beer or heavy spirits, there are different processes that I'm not going to get into here, but they're all processes of making alcohol from some food source. Corn mash makes the white lightning, or uh, not grapes. Juniper berries make gin, potatoes make vodka, uh, and what is it? The agave makes tequila, um, sugarcane makes rum, etc., etc. So every type of sugar source that's an efficient way to feed some organisms can be converted into alcohol, and then we can either bottle it directly, age it possibly, or distill it further to concentrate the alcohol. And we can mix other things in as well. So, I've had a number of different wines that have been with rhubarb or strawberry or apple or other things added in a certain percentage to the grapes to give a different flavor characteristic. But basically, you're fermenting, you're adding food, sugar, with some other components to create alcohol, and what's left over gives the characteristic and the flavor that's now your product. There are lots and lots of different procedures with different winemakers. There's a whole science called enology, the study of winemaking, and it differs by winery, by region, and by country. The way they do it in Italy isn't quite the same. They do it here in the US isn't quite the same. They do it in France. There's a lot of trends. Now, some people certainly try to bring an international trend into their process. So you might have somebody in Napa who is trying their best to follow very French winemaking styles for marketing purpose and flavor purpose. But there are definitely distinct differences from winemaker to winemaker, from region to region, from country to country. And those differences include different winemaking techniques. We'll talk about some of those in this lecture, different recipes, things going into the wine that are not procedural, but the recipes are more talking about the actual ingredients, and the final outcomes. What are you trying to do? What's your goal for that particular wine? And you can start with the same grape and hand it to 10 different winemakers, and you're going to end up with 10 different wines. It's highly unlikely they're going to come up with virtually the same thing. There's literally millions of possibilities that you can combine with all of these different steps and techniques and recipes. Certainly the desired wine style dictates the techniques that are employed. You always start at the end, the finished product that you have in mind, and work your way back to the beginning. All right, if I want that at the end, what do I have to do at the beginning? What are all the steps I have to do to get there? Occasionally, things don't go as planned, and you have to make changes along the way. That's not what a winemaker wants to do. They want to have a good goal, a good plan to get that goal achieved, and have everything go as planned. But when it doesn't go as planned, there are also techniques and recipe tricks to try to salvage, fix, or retain a quality product when it looks like it's going the wrong way. But it's not just about the recipe. It's not just about the technique. You've got certainly limited amounts of time. You've got your employees that are working for you that are trained a certain way. You have to put together the entire package of your operation to understand how you can or can't make it functional, make it work. You can lose a lot of money in the wine business. So you've got to be careful. Margins are thin. It's easy to try to spend more money than you're going to make, and that can't go on for very long. And the competition is extremely high. So you have to have a marketing idea. How am I going to distinguish myself? Why is a Safeway going to buy 100 cases of my wine if they can easily get 10,000 cases for less price from somebody else and not worry about it? What's unique about my product? Am I trying to sell something that's higher quality, unique flavor, or lower price? At 100 cases, you're probably not coming in at the low price model, but you have to have something because the competition is severe. So we've talked about growing. What does the winery do? Well, they're highly involved in the harvest and pre-harvest operations, trying to determine when the grapes they're planning on buying are ready for harvest. Now, some grapes are harvested and the customer is found after the fact, but that's not ideal. In a well-planned, perfect world, all of your blocks have a customer long before harvest date. And so your customer is out there looking at the grapes, sampling them for sugar and acid content, and helping to cooperate with the vineyard manager to determine that optimal harvest date and schedule that in with the winery operations and the vineyard operations themselves. there's only so many harvest crews. And at the winery, there's only so much crush pad space. When the grapes come in, they have to be driven up to the crush pad where the grapes are dumped from the harvest bins or harvest trucks. And they're dumped into the crush pad where they are crushed and destemmed and pressed and other things. That has to start happening right away. And so you can't have all of your grapes coming in on exactly the perfect day, because you might have one day where by your mathematical calculations, you've got 30 blocks that should be harvested. And the next 3 days, you've got none based on your ideal calculations. And then you've got another 8 blocks on Friday. And then you've got another 12 blocks on Saturday. And if you do it by ideal, perfect timing, they're never going to come in a nice, smooth fashion with a manageable number of pounds per day that you can handle at your crush pad and other winery operations. So you might need to pull some harvest a little early or push some a little later. And the winery is only half of the equation here. You also have harvest crews, harvest machines, bins, trucks, and all of that thing on the vineyard side. They can only do so many acres per day, so many pounds of product coming out per day. And they have to schedule what works for them as well. And so there's this compromise of the vineyard and what they need, the winery and what they need and can handle, and the grapes trying to schedule these two complicated things in such a way that the grapes are coming out of the vineyards as close to their optimal time as possible. And it's pretty tricky. It really is a tricky operation. And I've got several friends. My ex-wife is one of them, works at Scheid, and she and I talk all the time about how crazy it is. And it's just now in early November starting to calm down a little bit. A couple more weeks to go for them. And the winery usually has an extra couple of weeks of intense stress compared to the vineyards, because the vineyards, as soon as they're done harvesting, it does change quite a bit. The almost panic mode is over as soon as the last grape is taken out of the last block. But the winery, it just got that last grape and still has to crush and press and start fermentation. And it's still blowing and going pretty hard for a couple of weeks after the vineyards are pretty much done. And then they start to calm down a little bit, because now all of a sudden you've got a lot of fermentation and other things happening, but it's more routine. It's easier to manage. Things are moving in a more manageable way. So that's the big introduction on the harvest. We'll talk a little more about what crush actually is. Then there are the must additions. What the heck is that? We'll talk about the must, or the crushed grapes with the skins and seeds and all of the solids with the juice. Do you keep them together, or do you separate them right away? Depends on your wine that you're trying to make. Do you add anything at that time? You might add something as soon as they're crushed and pressed and ready. And what are you going to do with it? Are you going to add anything? Pressing is the separation of the juice from the solids. Settling or racking, you're trying to get any solids out, to settle out of the wine. Very important, especially in white wine grapes, because The reds, if you have cloudiness, you're not going to see it. Red wines are not transparent. They're dark and you can't see any cloudiness. White wines are supposed to look clear and bright and not have a muddyish color to them. And so settling and racking is really crucial in white wines. The fermentations, we talked about that a moment ago about yeast and the feeding of yeast sugar, in this case, to make alcohol. Once you are done with fermentation, then you have to age the wines, or you should age them for a certain amount of time, depends on the wine. Some are very short aged, some might be very, very long aged. And then do you blend them after fermentation? Maybe you blend them before fermentation. So you mix different grape pressings into the same fermentation chamber. Or afterwards, you taste the product and you go, you know what, this is good, but it would really help it with just a little hint of this flavor. So you add two different wines together to come up with the finished product for your consumer. But you do have to be careful with blending because there are limits on how you can blend. You might lose the ability to call it a California wine if you add too much. The rules for a state are a little more lax than if you have an actual appellation like Hames Valley or something. Now you're talking about a very specific appellation, and so the percentages are a little tighter compared to just saying it's a California wine. But you still have to keep a relatively high percentage if you're going to say an appellation name, a county name, or a state name on the wine. Filtering and cold stabilization, again, most crucial for the whites, and finally bottling. So those are the primary operations, but there are other things that go on as well in certain wineries. And I'm going to take a quick break here and be right back to start talking about these things in detail.